Elena Carter had devoted her life to dismantling the invisible barriers of racism that seeped into every facet of society. Just as she was poised to unveil a groundbreaking initiative to transform her airline from within, everything changed in an instant. During a high-stakes press conference, Elena confronted the deeply ingrained prejudices that had long plagued the company, only to be met with fierce resistance and public humiliation by entrenched executives. Within minutes, her career was shattered, and the repercussions rippled far beyond the boardroom, igniting a firestorm of controversy and unexpected alliances. What happened next shocked everyone and set off a chain of events no one could have foreseen. Stay with me, this is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, comment below and let us know where you're watching from today. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe for more. It was just an ordinary day until everything changed. Elena Carter arrived at the airport with the kind of confidence that turned heads. At 35, she had spent years honing the poise and assurance that came with being a prominent advocate for equity and justice. Dressed in a sharply tailored gray suit, her natural curls framed a face marked by quiet determination. Yet, beneath her composed exterior, a familiar unease stirred, an unease rooted in years of navigating spaces where her presence was often questioned before her worth was proven. The boarding gate buzzed with anticipation, the steady announcements of flight schedules blending with the muted hum of conversation. Elena approached gate 12, her first-class ticket ready. She glanced briefly at the travelers around her, noting the subtle glances, some curious, others indifferent. She was used to this, a black woman walking into spaces that seemed to whisper she didn't belong. When the gate agent called for first-class passengers, Elena stepped forward. The agent, a young man with a practiced smile, barely glanced at her ticket before waving her through. She appreciated his professionalism, but she also knew this was just the first hurdle. She had learned long ago that the most unassuming moments often carried the sharpest edges. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin gleamed with the kind of quiet luxury designed to soothe the harried traveler. Plush seats, soft lighting, and the faint scent of leather created an atmosphere of exclusivity. Elena walked toward her seat, her briefcase clutched firmly in her hand. She allowed herself a small smile as she sat down in 2A, her favorite seat by the window. She exhaled, hoping for a moment of peace. It didn't last. "Excuse me, ma'am," a voice interrupted, clipped and polite in a way that was meant to assert authority. Elena looked up to see a young flight attendant standing before her. His uniform was crisp, his posture upright, but there was something in his eyes, an unease, a flicker of judgment that he couldn't quite mask. "Yes?" Elena replied, her tone calm, though her muscles tensed instinctively. "I need to see your boarding pass," he said. Elena frowned. "I already showed my ticket at the gate. Is there a problem?" "It's just standard procedure," he said, though his gaze flickered over her briefly, lingering on her tailored suit, her natural hair, and the understated pearl earrings she wore. Standard procedure. Elena had heard those words before, in contexts that were anything but standard. Suppressing a sigh, she retrieved her ticket and handed it to him. The flight attendant, whose name tag read, Fred Barnes, studied it for longer than necessary before handing it back. "No issue," he muttered, stepping away quickly. Elena watched him retreat, her calm exterior masking the slow churn of emotions within her. She wasn't unfamiliar with this kind of scrutiny. It was the quiet, insidious kind of injustice that did its damage not in loud, obvious ways but in small, relentless cuts. She had faced it in boardrooms, at conferences, and in restaurants. She had fought against it in courtrooms and speeches. But here, at 30,000 feet, she had hoped for a brief reprieve. As other passengers filed in, Elena tried to focus on her purpose for this trip. She was heading to New York to deliver a keynote speech at a global summit on healthcare inequities, a deeply personal mission inspired by the legacy of her father, Dr. Samuel Carter. His death years ago, after being denied emergency care because of his race, had become the catalyst for her career. The cabin door closed, and the plane began to taxi. Elena closed her eyes, hoping to find solace in the hum of the engines. Instead, she found herself back in the sterile hospital waiting room where her father had died. She remembered the paramedics' hesitation, the whispered questions about whether he could pay, the cold indifference of the staff who saw his skin before they saw his humanity. A soft chime signaled the seatbelt sign turning off. Pulling her back to the present, Fred reappeared with a tray of drinks. He served the elderly couple across the aisle with a warm smile and easy charm. When he turned to Elena, his demeanor shifted. The warmth was gone, replaced by a stiffness that felt deliberate. "Something to drink?" he asked, his tone brusque. "Water, please," Elena replied, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her chest. Fred handed her the glass without meeting her eyes. Before she could take a sip, a voice from behind broke the growing tension. "Excuse me, young man," said an older woman, her voice firm yet kind. Elena turned to see Martha Ellison, a white-haired woman with sharp blue eyes that radiated both wisdom and conviction. She sat 2 rows back, her posture straight and dignified. "Yes, ma'am?" Fred asked, his tone faltering. "Is there a reason you're treating this young lady differently than the rest of us?" Martha's words were slow, deliberate, and piercing. Fred froze, his confidence unraveling under Martha's gaze. "I am not sure what you mean," he stammered. "Oh, I think you know," Martha replied, her tone unwavering. "I've seen this kind of thing before, and it doesn't sit right with me." The cabin grew quiet. Passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending not to notice, others openly watching. Elena's cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment but with the familiar heat of indignation. She met Martha's gaze and gave her a faint, appreciative nod. Fred mumbled an apology and hurried down the aisle, leaving behind an atmosphere heavy with unspoken truths. Martha smiled softly at Elena, a look that spoke of battles fought and wisdom earned. As the plane ascended into the clouds, Elena gazed out the window. The endless expanse of sky reflected back her own sense of endless struggle. She thought of her father's words, spoken on their porch one summer evening: "You'll have to be twice as good, Elena, because the world will only see half of you. But don't let it break you." It hadn't broken her, but moments like this reminded her of the fractures that never quite healed. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin, a backdrop of white noise that lulled some passengers to sleep. Elena, however, couldn't find rest. Her water glass sat untouched on the tray table, its condensation pooling slowly beneath it. Outside the window, clouds stretched endlessly, but her mind was elsewhere, somewhere darker and more familiar. It began as a flicker, a memory she rarely allowed herself to revisit. The air grew heavy, the hum of the engines fading as the hospital waiting room of her youth took its place. She was 13 again, her legs swinging restlessly from the cold, hard chair. Her mother sat beside her, silent but visibly trembling, gripping her purse so tightly the knuckles of her brown hands turned white. Elena had been too young to fully grasp what was happening at the time, but she had understood enough. She remembered the paramedic's dismissive tone, the question that shouldn't have been asked but was, "Can he afford treatment?" Her father, Dr. Samuel Carter, a man who had spent his life healing others, was denied the same humanity he had given so freely. They hadn't rushed to save him. They hadn't cared to. By the time they were finally taken to the emergency room, it was too late. Elena's chest tightened as the memory overwhelmed her. She closed her eyes, willing herself back to the present. But the ache remained. Her father's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was an indictment of a system designed to fail people like him and people like her. It had been the catalyst for everything she had done since: her studies, her career, her unrelenting fight against inequity. But even after all her successes, moments like the one with Fred reminded her that the world hadn't changed as much as she'd hoped. A sharp jolt shook the plane, pulling her abruptly from her thoughts. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've encountered a bit of turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." The turbulence wasn't severe, but it was enough to unsettle the cabin. Passengers stirred, adjusting their belts and muttering softly. Elena tightened hers and glanced around. Across the aisle, Martha sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin with quiet vigilance. Fred appeared again, walking briskly down the aisle to check on the passengers. When he reached Elena's row, his gaze flicked to her for the briefest of moments before he moved on. Not saying a word, the slight didn't go unnoticed. Martha's lips tightened, but she said nothing. Elena, too, remained silent. But inside, the tension built. It wasn't just Fred's actions, it was the way they mirrored so many others. the way they seemed to echo the same unspoken question. Do you really belong here? As the turbulence subsided, Fred returned with a cart of snacks. He moved efficiently through the rows, chatting amiably with the elderly couple across from Elena. His tone was light, his smile easy, and for a moment, Elena thought perhaps the earlier interaction had been a misunderstanding. But when he reached her, the shift was palpable. Do you want anything? He asked. His tone clipped. Elena hesitated, her composure wavering for the first time. No, thank you, she replied, her voice steady but strained. Fred moved on without a word, but his dismissal lingered like a shadow. The murmur of the cabin seemed louder now, a chorus of whispers and stolen glances. Elena could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest, threatening to choke her. And then, it happened. A voice loud, clear, and filled with righteous indignation cut through the tension. Excuse me, young man, Martha called out. I think we need to have a word. Fred froze mid-step, turning slowly to face her. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as Martha fixed him with a gaze that could pierce steel. I couldn't help but notice, she began, her tone measured but sharp, that your manners seem to change depending on who you're speaking to. Fred's face flushed red. I don't know what you mean, he stammered. Oh, I think you do, Martha said, her voice rising slightly. You've gone out of your way to be polite to everyone else in this cabin. But when it comes to this young lady, she gestured to Elena, your tone shifts. Your demeanor changes. Why is that? Passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Fred and Martha. Some averted their gaze, pretending not to notice, while others watched with a mix of curiosity and unease. Elena sat frozen, her cheeks burning with a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. Fred opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The silence stretched, heavy and charged. Well, Martha pressed. Do you have an answer? I didn't mean anything by it. Fred mumbled, his voice barely audible. Didn't mean anything by it. Martha repeated, her tone dripping with disdain. That's the problem, isn't it? You don't even realize what you're doing. But let me tell you something. Young man, intent doesn't erase impact. Your actions have consequences, whether you mean them or not. Fred's face was crimson now, and he looked as though he wished the floor would swallow him whole. The tension in the cabin was palpable, the air thick with unspoken truths. Elena finally found her voice. It's fine, she said softly, though it was clear to everyone that it wasn't. No, it's not fine, Martha said, turning to Elena with a fierce intensity. It's not fine, and it hasn't been fine for far too long. Someone needs to say something, and I'm saying it. Her words hung in the air, a challenge and a reckoning all at once. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the elderly man across the aisle gave a small nod of agreement. A young woman further back murmured something to her seatmate. The ripples of Martha's defiance began to spread. Fred, looking thoroughly chastened, muttered another apology and retreated to the galley. Martha sat back in her seat, her expression calm but resolute. Elena turned to her, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you. Martha gave her a small, knowing smile. Don't thank me, dear. Thank yourself for being here. That's all the proof you need that you belong. As the plane continued its journey, Elena stared out the window, her reflection gazing back at her. The storm inside her had quieted, but the clouds ahead seemed endless. Still, for the first time in a long while, she felt something unexpected, hope. The battle wasn't over. It never was. But today, at least, she wasn't fighting it alone. The cabin settled into a tense quiet after Martha's confrontation with Fred. Passengers pretended to busy themselves with their books, tablets, or idle conversation, but an unspoken unease hung in the air like the faint smell of ozone before a storm. Elena tried to focus on the soft rumble of the engines, but her mind was restless, replaying the scene over and over. Why had it taken Martha, a stranger, to call out the injustice she'd faced? Why did these moments always feel like they cut deeper than the last? For all her accomplishments, for all the rooms she'd entered where she'd made her presence known. Moments like this reminded her of the fragile thread she walked every day. She glanced over at Martha, who sat calmly with her hands folded in her lap. The older woman seemed unbothered, as if calling out injustice was as natural to her as breathing. There was something grounding in her presence, a kind of quiet authority that made Elena feel less alone. Fred remained in the galley for an unusually long time. He wasn't tending to the first-class passengers or offering his usual charm to the cabin. When he finally emerged, his face was flushed, and his movements were quick, almost jerky. He avoided eye contact with everyone, including Elena, as he moved down the aisle. But something had shifted. Elena noticed it in the way the elderly couple across the aisle exchanged glances. Their discomfort evident. She noticed it in the way the younger woman in the back row pulled out her phone, her fingers flying over the screen. Even without looking, Elena could feel the scrutiny of the cabin, the weight of curiosity, judgment, and the invisible lines being drawn. The tension escalated during the meal service. Fred returned to the first-class cabin, this time accompanied by another flight attendant, an older woman with a no-nonsense air about her. Elena watched as they moved from row to row, their interactions with the passengers seamless until they reached her. "Ms. Carter," Fred said stiffly, his voice carrying an edge he couldn't quite mask. "We'd like to offer you a complimentary bottle of wine for the inconvenience earlier." Elena raised an eyebrow, her instincts immediately on high alert. She glanced at Martha, who was watching the interaction with narrowed eyes. "That's very kind of you," Elena said evenly, "but I don't drink." Fred's face tightened. "Perhaps a dessert, then? Or, I'd prefer not to be singled out." Elena interrupted, her tone sharp but controlled. "What I would appreciate is being treated like every other passenger." The silence that followed was deafening. Fred's expression flickered, a mix of frustration and something else, shame, perhaps. But before he could respond, the older flight attendant stepped in. "Of course, Ms. Carter," she said, her tone brisk. "We'll ensure everything is to your satisfaction for the rest of the flight." They moved on quickly, but the damage had been done. Elena could feel the weight of the cabin's collective gaze, the simmering undercurrent of tension that had been building since she boarded. It wasn't just about the wine or the dessert, it was about the message those gestures carried. The quiet implication that her presence was an inconvenience to be smoothed over, rather than a right to be acknowledged. As the plane flew on, the unease in the cabin began to manifest in subtle, insidious ways. A middle-aged man seated in 1A leaned over to whisper something to his wife, who glanced at Elena with a look that was both pitying and dismissive. A younger passenger pulled out her phone to snap a photo, the flash reflecting off Elena's briefcase before she could protest. Martha noticed. "Excuse me," she said loudly, addressing the woman with the phone. "Are you taking pictures of her? Because that's incredibly rude." The woman stammered, quickly lowering her phone. "No, I wasn't." "Save it," Martha said curtly. "She's not a spectacle." The exchange drew more attention, and Elena's frustration deepened. The issue wasn't just Fred anymore, it was the entire cabin. The way the passengers' reactions revealed the layers of bias and assumption lurking beneath the surface. She felt exposed, as though she were fighting a battle on all sides, with no clear way to win. The breaking point came when turbulence struck again. The plane jolted sharply, and a chorus of gasps rippled through the cabin. The pilot's voice came over the intercom, reassuring everyone that the turbulence was temporary. But the air of anxiety in the cabin only seemed to amplify the tensions that had been simmering all flight. Fred appeared once more, moving down the aisle to check on passengers. When he reached Elena's row, he hesitated. His expression was tight, his movements uncertain. "Are you all right, Ms. Carter?" he asked, his voice strained. Elena stared at him, her patience finally wearing thin. "I'll be fine once this flight is over," she said coldly. Fred flinched as though she'd struck him. He opened his mouth to respond, but Martha cut in before he could speak. "Fred," she said sharply, "perhaps you should focus on doing your job instead of making her feel like she's the problem." Her words landed with the force of a slap. The cabin fell silent again, the air thick with unspoken tension. Fred looked as though he wanted to argue but thought better of it. He turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched. For the remainder of the flight, the tension didn't dissipate. It lingered, a heavy presence that pressed on everyone in the cabin. Elena stared out the window, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She thought of her father, of the indignities he had faced and the quiet strength he had carried. She thought of the countless others who had endured similar moments, their experiences unseen and unacknowledged. By the time the plane began its descent, Elena felt both exhausted and resolute. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been made to feel out of place. Every injustice that had been swept under the rug. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the plane touched down, Martha leaned over and placed a hand on Elena's arm. "You handled that with more grace than they deserved," she said softly, "but don't let it rest. These things don't change unless we make them." Elena nodded, her gaze steady. "Oh, I won't let it rest." The storm might have passed for now, but Elena knew it wasn't over. The real fight was just beginning. The flight touched down smoothly, but the tension that had filled the first-class cabin lingered like an unwelcome guest. Elena Carter's chest felt heavy, her thoughts swirling as she gathered her belongings. Around her, passengers shifted awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. Martha Ellison remained close, her steady presence a quiet reassurance. Yet, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down at something far larger than the events of the past few hours. Fred Barnes, the flight attendant whose actions had ignited the silent storm, stood near the exit with the forced politeness of someone eager to put the entire ordeal behind him. As Elena approached, their eyes met briefly. His lips moved, forming what might have been an apology, but the words were too faint to register. Elena kept walking, her silence louder than any response she could have mustered. Outside the terminal, the air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of jet fuel and anticipation. Elena paused for a moment, closing her eyes and taking a deep breath. She needed to ground herself, to push away the rising tide of anger and frustration that threatened to consume her. But even as she tried to let it go, the weight of what had happened and what it represented pressed harder against her chest. "Elena," Martha's voice broke through her thoughts. The older woman stepped beside her, her sharp blue eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" Elena hesitated. The easy answer was no. But the truth felt too complicated to put into words. "I'm managing," she said finally. Martha studied her for a moment before nodding. "Good, because I think you're going to need that strength." Elena frowned, unsure what she meant until her phone buzzed. The notification was from a social media platform. Curious, Elena opened it, only to find a video of herself seated on the plane, her face tense as Fred questioned her boarding pass. The caption read, "When will this stop? Black woman targeted in first class." Her heart sank as she scrolled through the comments. Some were supportive, expressing outrage and solidarity, but others ugly, venomous, and dripping with condescension told a different story. She probably didn't even pay for the seat. Always playing the race card. Another entitled "Crybaby." Elena's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about her anymore. The incident on the plane had become a public spectacle. A flashpoint for the larger conversation about race and bias that America seemed unable or unwilling to resolve. By the time she arrived at her hotel, the video had gone viral. News outlets were picking up the story, and reporters were already reaching out for comments. Elena felt the walls closing in, the private pain of the day morphing into a public debate she hadn't asked for. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was her brother, Malcolm Carter, the CEO of the airline. His voice was sharp when she answered. "Elena, what the hell is going on?" She closed her eyes, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I didn't ask for this." "Malcolm, well, it's happening," he shot back. "I've got board members calling me. Investors freaking out. This is a PR nightmare." Elena's patience snapped. "A nightmare for you? Do you have any idea what it feels like to be humiliated like that?" "Malcolm, to have my humanity questioned in front of a plane full of people? Don't make this about your company." The line went silent for a moment, and when Malcolm spoke again, his tone was softer. "You're right, I'm sorry, but this isn't just about the airline. It's about how we handle it, and we can't afford to mess this up." Malcolm's words stayed with Elena long after their conversation ended. She sat by the window, staring out at the city lights, her thoughts a tangle of anger, exhaustion, and purpose. The incident on the plane was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. A reflection of the systemic issues she had spent her career trying to dismantle. And now, whether she wanted to or not, she was being thrust into the center of the fight. The next morning, the fight came to her doorstep. A crowd had gathered outside the hotel, protesters holding signs, reporters clamoring for statements, and onlookers drawn by the spectacle. Elena hesitated before stepping outside, unsure if she was ready to face them. But then she saw Martha standing near the edge of the crowd. Her presence a steady beacon. "Elena," a reporter called out as she approached. "Do you think what happened on the flight is indicative of systemic racism in the airline industry?" The question hit like a slap, its bluntness leaving no room for evasion. Elena took a deep breath, steadying herself before responding. "Yes," she said firmly, her voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. "What happened to me on that flight wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern of bias and exclusion that has been baked into our institutions for far too long. And it needs to change." Her words ignited a flurry of questions. But she didn't wait to answer them. Instead, she turned and walked toward Martha, who greeted her with a small, approving nod. "Well said," Martha murmured. Elena smiled faintly. "It's the truth." But the truth, as Elena quickly learned, was not enough to calm the storm. The backlash was swift and brutal. Conservative commentators accused her of overreacting, framing the incident as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. Social media users dissected her words, twisting them into weapons. Even some of her allies urged her to tread carefully, warning her not to alienate potential supporters. Still, Elena refused to back down. She reached out to other activists, shared her story in interviews, and began working on an op-ed that would lay out her case for systemic reform. Each step was a battle, but each battle brought her closer to the goal she had dedicated her life to achieving. As night fell, Elena found herself back at the window, gazing out at the city below. Her phone buzzed with a text from Martha. "Proud of you today. Keep fighting." Elena smiled, a spark of hope flickering in her chest. The road ahead was long and fraught with challenges. But she knew she wasn't walking it alone. The storm might rage on, but she was ready to face it one step at a time. The next morning, the world seemed to move faster. Elena Carter woke up to a flood of notifications. Her inbox was overflowing with emails, some offering solidarity, others dripping with vitriol. News outlets had dissected every second of the now viral video. Analysts debated whether the flight attendant's actions were racially motivated, while opinion pieces speculated on what her response said about the larger conversation on race in America. Elena skimmed through the headlines with a detached numbness. Entitled "Passenger or Victim of Bias?" Another flashpoint in the culture wars. Black Lives Matter takes to the skies. She closed her laptop, her chest tight. The noise was deafening, but the silence beneath it, the lack of understanding. The refusal to confront the deeper truth was worse. By mid-morning, her brother Malcolm called again. "Elena," he said, his voice clipped. "We need to talk about how we're handling this." "We?" Elena's tone was sharp. "This isn't about your airline's image, Malcolm. This is about what actually happened." Malcolm sighed, exasperated. "I know that, but this isn't just a personal issue anymore. It's become political. The board wants to release a statement, but they're worried about acknowledging fault." "Worried about acknowledging fault?" Elena snapped. "How about being worried about doing what's right? Or is that too radical for them?" "Elena, you don't understand how this works," Malcolm began, but she cut him off. "No, Malcolm, you don't understand. This isn't just about me, it's about the thousands of people who face this kind of treatment every day. If your airline can't take a stand, then what's the point of all your so-called diversity initiatives?" The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "I'll see what I can do," Malcolm said finally, his voice low. Elena's frustration boiled over as she hung up. She felt trapped between two worlds: the corporate pragmatism Malcolm embodied and the grassroots urgency she had always championed. Each side wanted something from her, but neither seemed willing to confront the uncomfortable truths that lay at the heart of the matter. She needed an outlet. That evening, Elena attended a community forum organized by a local activist group. The event was held in a church basement, its walls adorned with posters demanding justice and equity. A small but diverse crowd had gathered, their faces reflecting the weariness and determination of those who had spent years fighting battles that felt endless. When Elena stepped up to speak, the room fell silent. "Thank you for having me here tonight," she began, her voice steady despite the weight in her chest. "The incident on that flight was humiliating. Yes, but it wasn't surprising. It was a reflection of something much deeper, a system that has conditioned us to see people like me as out of place. No matter how hard we work, how much we achieve, or how many barriers we break." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unflinching. "But here's the thing," she continued, her voice rising with conviction. This isn't just about me. It's about the millions of stories that go untold. It's about the quiet humiliations, the unspoken biases, and the ways we've been taught to accept them as normal. Well, I'm here to say that it's not normal. It's not acceptable, and it has to stop. The room erupted into applause, the energy palpable, but even as Elena felt a flicker of hope, she knew the hardest battles were yet to come. The next day brought new challenges. Malcolm had managed to convince the board to release a statement, but it was a carefully worded piece of corporate doublespeak that acknowledged the incident without admitting any wrongdoing. Elena read it and felt her stomach churn. "We deeply regret any discomfort experienced by Ms. Carter during her flight and remain committed to fostering an inclusive environment for all our passengers." The statement was immediately met with backlash. Activists called it a hollow gesture. Critics on the right accused the airline of pandering. The company was caught in the crossfire, and Malcolm's phone calls became increasingly frantic. "We need to meet," he said, "in person. This is spiraling out of control." When they met in a sleek, glass-walled conference room at the airline's headquarters, the tension between them was almost tangible. Malcolm looked worn, his usual polished demeanor fraying at the edges. "Elena, this is bigger than you or me," he said, pacing. "The board is panicking. They want this to go away. And you think I don't?" Elena shot back. "You think I enjoy being reduced to a headline, or having strangers dissect my life online? But I won't let this go away, Malcolm, because it's not just about me. It's about all the people who don't have the platform I do to speak out." Malcolm stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you want us to do?" he asked finally. Elena took a deep breath. "I want accountability. I want transparency. And I want real change, not just lip service." Their conversation marked a turning point, but the road ahead was still treacherous. That night, as Elena walked through the city, she saw a mural painted on the side of a building. It depicted a black woman with her head held high, surrounded by words like dignity, justice, and resilience. For the first time in days, Elena felt a flicker of peace. The fight was far from over, but she wasn't alone in it. She never had been. The storm was still raging, but now, she could see the cracks of light breaking through the clouds. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting long shadows across Elena Carter's apartment as she stared blankly at the ceiling. The events of the past few days had left her drained, yet an insatiable fire burned within her. The incident on the flight had not only exposed the airline's ingrained biases but had also ignited a broader conversation that Elena knew was only beginning to swell. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the bedside table, a relentless reminder of the chaos unfolding beyond her sanctuary. Malcolm's latest message glowed on the screen. "We need a plan. The board is demanding immediate action. They're panicking." Elena sighed, rubbing her temples. The weight of leadership pressed down on her shoulders, a burden she had never sought but couldn't escape. Determined to turn the tide, Elena opened her laptop and began drafting a comprehensive response. She outlined the steps needed for genuine reform: mandatory bias training for all employees, the establishment of an independent oversight committee, and the creation of a scholarship fund for underrepresented groups in aviation. Each keystroke was a step toward accountability, a declaration that silence would no longer be acceptable. As she worked, her thoughts drifted to Martha Ellison. The older woman's unwavering support had been a beacon of strength, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. Elena reached for her phone and sent a quick text. "Thank you for everything. Your support means the world." She didn't expect an immediate reply, but the gesture felt necessary, a small anchor in the storm. Meanwhile, Malcolm sat in his office, the boardroom now a battlefield of opinions and strategies. He glanced at the clock, noting how time was slipping away faster than he anticipated. The board members were restless, their faces etched with anxiety and frustration. "We can't afford delays," Charles Whitman, a senior director with a penchant for traditionalism, snapped. "Our reputation is on the line. We need a public statement that appeases the media and our stakeholders." Rachel Thompson, one of the younger board members advocating for transparency, interjected. "An apology is a start. But it's not enough. We need to show real commitment to change. Our policies have failed people like Elena, and this is our chance to make things right." Malcolm rubbed his temples, the tension evident in the lines on his face. "I agree, Rachel, but how far are we willing to go? These changes will require significant investment and time. Not to mention, they'll disrupt our current operations. Rachel leaned forward, her eyes burning with determination. The cost of inaction is far greater. We risk alienating our customer base, losing talent, and perpetuating a cycle of injustice. We need to lead by example, not by retreating in fear. The room fell silent, the gravity of her words sinking in. Malcolm knew she was right, but the path forward was fraught with challenges. He had spent years trying to balance profitability with progressive values. And now, the scales were tipping dramatically. As the day progressed, Elena continued her outreach. She spoke at community centers, engaged with activists, and shared her story on various platforms. Her voice resonated with those who had long felt marginalized, giving them a sense of solidarity and hope. Yet, with every step forward, the backlash grew fiercer. That afternoon, as Elena prepared for another forum, her phone buzzed with another message from Malcolm. "Can we meet tonight? We need to finalize the strategy." She nodded to herself, knowing that their conversation could either bridge the growing divide or deepen the rift between them. That evening, they met in a quiet corner of a local cafe. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee a stark contrast to the tension brewing between them. Malcolm looked weary, the stress of the past weeks etched into his features. "Elena," he began, his voice tinged with frustration. "We're being pulled in every direction. The board is demanding immediate fixes. The media is relentless, and our investors are scared. We need to present a united front." Elena leaned forward, her eyes locked on his. "I understand the pressure, Malcolm, but we can't sacrifice our principles for temporary peace. If we don't address the root causes of these issues, we're just putting bandages on a wound that will never heal." Malcolm sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I want to do what's right, but there's a balance we need to strike. We can't let this destroy the company. And we can't let it destroy the people who believe in us." Elena countered, "You've built this company to be a leader in diversity and inclusion. Don't let fear make you forget why you started." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing on the table. Malcolm glanced at it and saw it was Charles Whitman calling. He excused himself, stepping outside to take the call. Elena watched him go, the weight of their disagreement lingering between them like an invisible barrier. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Elena's efforts to mobilize support gained traction, but so did the resistance. She received messages of gratitude from those who felt seen for the first time, but also vitriol from those who clung to outdated prejudices. Each day brought new challenges, new moments where the undercurrents of racism threatened to surface and drag everything down. One afternoon, Elena received an unexpected invitation to a closed-door meeting with Malcolm and a few key board members. Her heart raced as she walked into the conference room. The stark white walls a reminder of the sterile environment she so often had to navigate. "We need to discuss your proposals," Malcolm began, gesturing toward the documents she had sent earlier. "They're ambitious, but necessary." Elena nodded, taking a seat. "I believe these steps are crucial for real, lasting change. It's not just about responding to this incident, it's about transforming our entire approach to equity and inclusion." Charles Whitman leaned forward, his expression skeptical. "These initiatives will require a significant overhaul. It's not something we can implement overnight." Rachel Thompson spoke up, her voice firm, "But it's something we must start now. The longer we wait, the deeper the wounds will become." Elena felt a surge of determination. "Every day we delay, we perpetuate the very injustices we claim to be fighting against. We need to lead, not just follow." The room was silent, the tension thick as the board members weighed her words. Finally, Malcolm spoke, his voice softer but no less resolute. "We need to make this work, Elena, for the company, for our employees, and for our passengers." Elena met his gaze, seeing a flicker of hope amidst the uncertainty. "It's going to be a long road, but it's a journey worth taking." As the meeting concluded, Elena felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The path forward was clear, but the challenges were only beginning. She knew that with each step she took, the stakes would grow higher, the resistance fiercer. But she also knew that she couldn't turn back, not now. Not when so many were depending on her courage and resilience. Walking out of the building, Elena looked up at the sky. The clouds beginning to break and reveal patches of blue. The rising tide of change was unstoppable. But it was a tide that needed to be navigated with strength and unwavering purpose. As she walked to her car, she felt the first rays of hope warming her resolve. The fight was far from over. But for the first time, she could see a way through the storm. Elena sat in her apartment, staring at her phone. It had been a week since the meeting with Malcolm and the board. The media frenzy had not slowed, if anything. It had intensified. The backlash was no longer just confined to online comments. It had crept into the mainstream, seeping into office buildings, boardrooms, and the everyday lives of people who never thought twice about the issues Elena had been fighting for so long. The pressure was mounting, and Elena could feel the weight of it pressing against her chest. Every conversation, every decision, was now a matter of public scrutiny. She thought back to Martha's words, "You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for a whole history of injustice that still lives in the cracks of our institutions." Elena had to carry that history with her, even when it threatened to break her. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. "We've received multiple complaints about your demands for accountability. We don't need any more disruption. Your personal grievances are one thing, but you're harming the business now. Get it together." The message, signed anonymously, made her blood run cold. She had expected resistance, of course. But something about the cold, anonymous threat cut deeper than the usual corporate pushback. It felt personal, a reminder that she wasn't just fighting a company, but the entrenched systems that had always pushed people like her to the margins. Elena set the phone down, her mind racing. This was no longer just a battle for change. It was a battle for her very existence within a system that wanted to keep her in a box. Silent and compliant, and that, she realized, was where her true challenge lay, not in the resistance she faced on the outside, but in the internalized biases that still tried to creep in, even after all these years. That evening, Elena attended a rally in downtown. It wasn't planned, not exactly, but the momentum of the past few weeks had built into something larger than any one person. People had gathered on their own, activists, students, workers, all demanding accountability, transparency, and a real commitment to change. It was a moment of collective strength. And Elena needed that energy. Needed to feel part of something bigger than herself. As she arrived, the crowd roared in support. Their voices echoed through the streets, calling for justice, equality, and the eradication of systemic oppression. Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her. This was why she was fighting. For all of them. But as the evening wore on, the tension began to build. It started with a few shouting matches between protesters and counter-protesters, and quickly escalated as a few agitators infiltrated the crowd. The atmosphere shifted, the initial optimism replaced by a simmering anger. "Elena!" someone shouted through the crowd. It was Martha. Her face was tight with concern. "You need to leave. Now." "What's going on?" Elena asked, but she already knew. "It's about to get ugly," Martha said, pulling her arm. "You're a target right now. And they're not playing fair." Elena hesitated, her feet rooted to the ground. She had been in movements before, had seen anger and rage turn into chaos. But this felt different. The lines between protest and violence were blurring. The crowd seemed to be dividing itself. And Elena couldn't help but feel as though she were standing on the edge of something irreparable. Suddenly, the shout of, "Get her!" echoed through the air. Elena's heart skipped a beat as a group of men wearing dark shirts surged toward her. They were chanting now, their voices filled with fury and fear, their faces twisted with rage. The words they spat made Elena's blood run cold. "You don't belong here." Elena stood frozen for a moment, feeling the weight of the world in their eyes. The sheer force of their hate made her stomach churn. It wasn't just the incident on the plane anymore. This was about something deeper, something older. The hatred that burned in their eyes wasn't just about a single event. It was about a lifetime of being told you didn't belong. You didn't matter. But before they could reach her, a surge of her people stepped in. Activists, friends, strangers, all pushing back against the tide of hate. Martha grabbed Elena's arm and pulled her into the safety of a nearby building. The door slammed behind them, the world outside still echoing with shouts and confusion. Elena's heart was racing, and for a moment, she wasn't sure if she could breathe. She had always known this fight would cost her. But now the cost was becoming far too real. "I thought," Elena started, her voice shaking, "I thought we were past this. That we could push for change without this level of violence. Martha looked at her, her expression hard. It's always been like this. Elena, you just didn't see it. People don't want to change. They want things to stay the same. Change is uncomfortable, it's a threat. The rally dissolved into chaos. Police had arrived, and the protest turned into a standoff between the demonstrators and the authorities. Elena watched from the safety of the building, her eyes scanning the crowd. She realized, in that moment, how much this fight had taken from her. She had been so focused on the bigger picture, on the changes she could force the system to make, that she had neglected the personal cost of living through it. This wasn't just a fight for change in the world. It was a fight for her own identity in a world that refused to accept her. By the time Elena returned to her apartment that night, her mind was buzzing with a mix of anger, exhaustion, and disbelief. She had pushed herself to the edge, demanding justice at every turn. But the resistance, the ferocity of it had left her questioning everything. In her quiet apartment, Elena stared at her reflection in the mirror. The image of a woman fighting against an unrelenting tide. The battle was no longer just about changing the policies of one airline. It was about confronting a system that had been built to keep her and people like her down. As the weight of the day pressed on her shoulders, Elena realized that the real battle was just beginning. The personal had merged with the political. And there was no turning back now. She was in this fight, not just for herself, but for the generations that had come before her, and for the ones who would inherit the world she was struggling to change. The storm outside raged on, but Elena stood firm in its path, ready to face whatever came next. The following morning dawned gray and oppressive, mirroring the turmoil that had settled over Elena Carter. The events of the rally still echoed in her mind. The shouts of hatred juxtaposed with the unwavering support of her allies. She sat by her window, watching as the city began to stir, each movement outside a reminder of the restless energy that had been unleashed. Her phone buzzed incessantly with messages, some of gratitude, others of condemnation. The line between support and scrutiny had blurred, leaving her feeling both empowered and vulnerable. Malcolm's voice cut through her thoughts once more. We need to push forward. Elena, the board is backing your proposals. But they expect immediate results. Elena nodded, though Malcolm couldn't see her. I understand, Malcolm, but real change takes time. We can't rush it without risking the integrity of our efforts. There was a pause before Malcolm responded, his frustration palpable. Time is something we don't have. The more we delay, the more entrenched the resistance becomes. We need to act decisively. Elena sighed, the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She knew he was right. Yet the path to genuine reform was fraught with obstacles. As she turned away from the window, her mind drifted to Martha Ellison, whose unwavering support had been a beacon of hope in the darkest moments. Later that day, Elena attended a meeting with Rachel Thompson and a few key activists. The room was small, the air thick with determination and the scent of strong coffee. Charts, graphs, and reports littered the table, evidence of the systemic issues they were striving to dismantle. We've seen a spike in negative comments and even threats against you. Rachel began, her voice steady. It's not just online anymore. People are getting more aggressive in person. Elena frowned, her thoughts interrupted by a loud knock on the door. The room fell silent as Malcolm entered, his face drawn and eyes weary. He held a folder tightly in his hands, his presence commanding yet strained. Elena, he greeted, his tone subdued. I've got news from the board. They're approving the first phase of the reforms. But they're implementing stricter monitoring and reporting measures. They want to ensure everything is documented meticulously. Elena took the folder, her fingers brushing the paper's edge. What does that mean for us? Malcolm hesitated before answering. It means more oversight, more pressure. They're not fully on board yet. They see the reforms as a way to placate the public rather than a genuine commitment to change. Elena opened the folder, scanning the contents quickly. The documents outlined detailed plans for bias training, new hiring practices, and the establishment of an independent committee. While it was a step in the right direction, the language was guarded, the promises vague. We need to hold them accountable, Elena asserted, her voice firm. Ensure that these changes aren't just superficial. We need transparency and follow through. Rachel nodded in agreement. We can't let them use this as a token gesture. We need to monitor their progress closely and keep the pressure on. As the meeting progressed, Elena felt a surge of determination. The road ahead was still uncertain. But with each step, the foundation for real change was being laid. Yet, beneath her resolve, a storm brewed, a storm fueled by the realization that the battle was far from over. That evening, Elena returned to her apartment to find her phone lit up with notifications. A new article had been published, titled, "Corporate Progress or Pretend? The Airline's Struggle with Racism." It was a scathing critique of the company's slow and often ineffective attempts at reform. The piece highlighted the very issues Elena and her team were fighting against, painting the company as a facade for deeper, unresolved biases. She scrolled through the comments, her heart sinking as she read the vitriol. All talk, no action, just another corporate stunt. They're too scared to make real changes. The negativity was relentless, each comment a dagger to her spirit. Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, not just from the anger and frustration, but from the exhaustion of constantly having to defend her cause. She sank into her chair, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. It was moments like these that made her question whether the fight was worth the personal cost. A soft knock on the door broke her reverie. She wiped her eyes and opened it to find Martha standing there, her expression gentle yet resolute. She held a small box in her hands, an offering of comfort. "I brought you something," Martha said softly. "You looked like you could use a friend." Elena managed a weary smile. "Thank you, Martha. Please, come in." They sat together in the living room, the conversation flowing easily between them. Martha shared stories of her own struggles, of the times she had felt powerless against a system stacked against her. Her words were a balm, a reminder that Elena wasn't alone in her fight. "You're stronger than you realize," Martha assured her, "and you have people who believe in you. Don't let the hate drown out the good you're doing." Elena nodded, feeling a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. "Thank you, Martha. Your support means everything." But even as they talked, the outside world continued to press in. Reports of other airlines facing similar issues surfaced, the problem proving to be widespread and deeply rooted. The pressure on Malcolm intensified, the board's demands growing more stringent as they struggled to maintain a semblance of control. One night, as Elena lay in bed, her thoughts restless, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from an anonymous source. "Stop making this personal. You're destroying us." The words seethed with anger, a direct threat to her mission. Elena stared at the message, her mind racing. This wasn't just about corporate policies anymore, it was personal. Someone wanted to silence her, to stop the movement she was helping to build. The realization was a bitter pill, one that made her feel more vulnerable than ever. The following day, Elena received an invitation to speak at a local university. The event was already filled with attendees, eager to hear her perspective on systemic racism and the steps needed for true reform. As she stood before the crowd, her voice strong and unwavering, she felt the collective hope of those gathered behind her. But midway through her speech, a loud commotion erupted from the back of the room. A group of individuals, fueled by anger and misinformation, began to shout, their voices rising in a cacophony of hate and resistance. They threw insults and challenged her authority, questioning her intentions and accusing her of tearing the community apart. Elena felt her heart race, the peaceful setting shattered by the intrusion of hate. But she didn't falter. Drawing strength from the faces of those who stood with her, she addressed the disruption with calm authority. "Your anger is misplaced," she said firmly. "This isn't about tearing down, it's about building up. We all deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of our backgrounds." The confrontation escalated, and soon, security personnel moved in to disperse the agitators. The room buzzed with tension, but Elena stood her ground, her resolve unbroken. The incident left her shaken, but also more determined. She realized that the resistance wasn't going to fade away, it was only growing stronger, more vocal. As she left the university, Elena felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. The challenges were mounting, each one more daunting than the last. But with every obstacle, her determination only deepened. She knew that the fight against systemic racism was far from over, and she was ready to face whatever came next. No matter how fierce the storm, the city lights shimmered in the distance, a beacon of hope amidst the darkness. Elena took a deep breath, her spirit resilient. The rising tide of change was relentless, but so was her will to see it through. The battle was intensifying, But so was her resolve to fight for a world where everyone could stand tall, unburdened by the shadows of prejudice. The journey was far from complete. But Elena knew that with each step, she was paving the way for a future where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a reality for all. The city was wrapped in the late afternoon haze, the sun a weary sentinel behind layers of smog. Elena Carter moved through the bustling streets with a sense of purpose, her mind a maelstrom of thoughts and emotions. The rally at the university had left her both invigorated and exhausted. The confrontation had been a stark reminder of the obstacles still lying in wait. But it had also solidified her resolve. She knew that to effect real change, she needed to harness the collective strength of her community and confront the systemic barriers head-on. Inside her apartment, the atmosphere was tense. Malcolm Carter was hunched over his desk, papers scattered around him like fallen soldiers after a battle. His phone lay face down, a testament to the endless calls and messages he had received. Elena could see the strain etched into his features, the weight of leadership pressing down on him with increasing intensity. "Elena," Malcolm began, his voice barely above a whisper, breaking the heavy silence, "we've hit a critical juncture. The board is demanding results. And they're not buying any of our long-term strategies. They want immediate action, even if it means superficial changes." Elena sighed, feeling the familiar pang of frustration. Superficial changes won't solve anything. "Malcolm, we need to stay focused on genuine reform, not just appeasing the board or the public." Malcolm ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of mounting desperation. "I understand that, but the backlash is relentless. Every step we take, it feels like we're fighting an uphill battle. The media is painting us as either weak or insincere. We need to find a way to turn this momentum into something tangible before it spirals out of control." Elena leaned forward, her eyes meeting his with unwavering determination. "We need to leverage this attention. Turn the public's outrage into a force for good. Organize more rallies. Engage with influencers who can amplify our message. And hold the airline accountable in every possible way." Before Malcolm could respond, Elena's phone buzzed again. This time, it was an urgent message from Rachel Thompson. "Emergency meeting at 3 p.m. Someone leaked internal documents exposing deeper issues within the airline. Need your input ASAP." Elena's heart skipped a beat. Internal documents? The implications were terrifying. If these documents contained evidence of systemic racism, corruption, or worse, it could either be the breakthrough they needed or the collapse of everything they had worked for. She glanced at Malcolm, whose face had paled upon seeing the message. "We need to get to that meeting. Now." At 3 p.m. sharp, Elena and Malcolm arrived at the community center, where Rachel had already gathered a small group of trusted activists and allies. The atmosphere was electric with urgency, the air thick with anticipation and fear. Rachel stood at the front, her expression grim. "Thank you both for coming on such short notice. We've received a package this morning. It contains internal memos, employee testimonies, and financial records that paint a damning picture of the airline's operations. This goes far beyond isolated incidents of discrimination. It's about a deeply entrenched system that prioritizes profit over people." Elena felt a chill run down her spine as she examined the documents. The memos revealed a concerted effort to suppress complaints, manipulate hiring practices to favor certain demographics superficially, and divert funds meant for diversity initiatives into inconsequential projects. The employee testimonies were heartbreaking, detailing experiences of microaggressions, outright racism, and retaliation against those who dared to speak out. "This is our chance," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "We can expose these practices and force the airline to confront its demons. But we need to act strategically. If we move too quickly, we risk everything being discredited or ignored." Elena nodded, her mind racing. "We need to collaborate with investigative journalists who have the credibility to handle this. We also need legal support to protect the whistleblowers and ensure the documents are admissible in any potential lawsuits." Malcolm, ever the strategist, added, "We should also mobilize our supporters to put pressure on the board. Organize a series of press conferences, town hall meetings, and leverage social media to keep the pressure constant." As the group discussed their plan, the room seemed to grow smaller, the stakes higher with each passing moment. The path to justice was becoming clearer, but so was the danger that accompanied it. They were standing on the precipice of something monumental, where one misstep could lead to their undoing. That evening, Elena prepared for the next phase of their strategy. She drafted statements, coordinated with journalists, and reached out to legal experts. The weight of responsibility pressed down on her, but she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in weeks. This was what she had been fighting for, not just personal vindication, but a systemic overhaul that could change countless lives. Meanwhile, Malcolm faced his own battles. The board had called an emergency meeting, demanding answers and quick fixes. As he stood before them, the tension was palpable. Board members questioned every move they had made, their skepticism unwavering. "We need to show progress," Malcolm stated firmly. "These documents prove that deeper issues exist, and ignoring them only makes us look worse. We need to take decisive action to dismantle these corrupt practices." Charles Whitman, ever the obstructionist, scoffed. "Decisive action sounds idealistic, but you're jeopardizing the company's stability. We can't afford to alienate our investors or our customer base." Rachel leaned forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "The cost of inaction is far greater. We're standing on the edge of a moral abyss, and we need to step back or risk falling into it." Malcolm met her gaze, feeling a surge of support. "We have a responsibility to our employees, our passengers, and our legacy. If we don't address these issues now, we're complicit in the harm that's been done." The boardroom erupted into a cacophony of voices, some in agreement, others vehemently opposed. The debate was fierce, but the evidence was undeniable. The documents laid bare the airline's failings, making it impossible to dismiss their demands for accountability. As the meeting adjourned, Malcolm felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. They had made progress, but the road ahead was still fraught with challenges. He knew that the coming days would test their resilience and their commitment to justice. Back at the community center, Elena and her team moved quickly to disseminate the information. Investigative journalists published exposés that detailed the airline's systemic issues, sparking outrage across the nation. Headlines screamed about corruption, racism, and the urgent need for reform. The public's reaction was swift and vehement, with protests erupting outside the airline's headquarters and calls for boycotts intensifying. Elena found herself at the center of a media storm, her every word scrutinized and dissected. She gave interviews, participated in panel discussions, and used every platform available to amplify their message. The support was overwhelming, but so was the opposition. Threats began to pour in, both online and offline, a clear indication that the airline's antagonists were determined to silence her. One night, as Elena prepared for a televised interview, her phone rang. It was Malcolm. "We need to talk about the latest threats," he said, his voice edged with worry. "Someone's trying to intimidate us. They're sending warnings to back off." Elena's heart raced. "What kind of threats?" "Anonymous messages, vague but menacing. They're saying that if we don't stop this now, there will be consequences. It's getting personal." "Elena, they're crossing the line." Elena felt a surge of anger and fear, but she pushed them aside. "We can't let them stop us. This is bigger than us. It's about justice for everyone who's been wronged." Malcolm sighed, the burden of leadership evident in his tone. "I know, but we need to be careful. We have to protect ourselves and our team." Elena nodded, her resolve unwavering. "We'll take precautions, but we can't let fear dictate our actions. We need to stay strong and keep pushing forward." The following days were a whirlwind of activism and advocacy. Elena's team organized workshops, community forums, and fundraising events to support their legal battles and outreach programs. The movement was gaining momentum, but so was the resistance. The airline's public relations team launched a counter-campaign, attempting to discredit Elena and her cause by portraying her as a troublemaker and a divisive figure. Social media became a battleground, with heated debates unfolding in real time. Supporters rallied around Elena, sharing her story and spreading awareness, while detractors attacked her character and motivations. The division within the community deepened, with friendships strained and families torn apart by differing perspectives. One evening, Elena received an invitation to a high-profile awards ceremony hosted by the airline, ostensibly to honor their diversity and inclusion efforts. The irony was not lost on her, and she felt a mix of anger and determination. This was a strategic move by the airline to regain public favor and divert attention from the mounting scandals. Determined to make a statement, Elena decided to attend not to accept the award, but to expose the truth. She coordinated with her team and secured the support of sympathetic media outlets, ensuring that her presence would amplify their message. As she walked onto the stage, the audience erupted into applause. Unaware of the tension simmering beneath the surface, Malcolm stood beside her, his expression a blend of pride and anxiety. Elena took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room filled with influential figures and corporate elites. "Thank you," she began, her voice strong and clear. "I'm here tonight not to accept an award, but to highlight the ongoing struggle for true equity and justice within this industry. The documents we've released reveal a troubling pattern of systemic racism and corruption that demands immediate and sustained action." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd, the room growing silent with the weight of her words. Elena continued, presenting the evidence they had uncovered and detailing the steps needed for meaningful reform. Her speech was a powerful indictment of the airline's practices, a call to action that could no longer be ignored. The response was immediate. Security personnel moved swiftly, attempting to usher Elena off the stage, but she stood her ground. "This isn't just about one company," she declared. "It's about dismantling the structures that perpetuate inequality and ensuring that no one else has to suffer the same injustices that my father did." As she left the stage, the room erupted into chaos, applause from supporters and outraged shouts from detractors. Elena felt a surge of adrenaline, knowing that this act of defiance would further galvanize the movement but also escalate the conflict. That night, Elena returned to her apartment, the events of the day replaying in her mind. She felt both empowered and exhausted, the lines between victory and vulnerability blurring. As she sank into her chair, her phone buzzed with another message from Rachel. "We need to brace for backlash. They're not going to take this lying down." Elena nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let them come, we're ready." But as she turned off the lights, the reality of the situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. The fight for justice was no longer a battle fought on a plane or in a conference room, it had become a full-scale war. With no clear end in sight, the challenges were mounting, each one more personal and perilous than the last. She thought of her father, of the quiet strength he had carried through years of oppression. His legacy was a beacon, guiding her through the darkest moments. But the path ahead was littered with obstacles, each one threatening to extinguish the light she so desperately tried to keep burning. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her mission pressing down on her. The storm was intensifying, but so was her determination. She knew that to truly honor her father's memory, she had to push forward, no matter the cost. The battle was far from over, and the road ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. But with every step, every act of defiance, she moved closer to the world she envisioned, a world where justice wasn't just an ideal, but a lived reality for all. As she gazed out the window, the city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always a spark of hope. Elena knew that the tide was rising, and with it, the possibility of real, lasting change. The journey was perilous, but she was ready to face whatever came next, driven by the unyielding belief that together, they could turn the tide against injustice and build a better future for everyone. The early morning sun filtered through the blinds of Elena Carter's apartment, casting long, narrow shadows across her desk cluttered with documents and notes. The weight of yesterday's confrontation at the awards ceremony pressed heavily upon her shoulders. She had stood before the crowd not as a participant, but as a disruptor, a truth-teller challenging the very foundations of an industry built on complacency and hidden prejudices. Now, the aftermath unfurled before her like a dark tapestry, each thread a reminder of the battles yet to come. Elena reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she read the latest barrage of messages. Support poured in from all corners, letters of solidarity from activists, heartfelt thanks from individuals who saw their own struggles reflected in her story, and declarations of support from unexpected allies within the community. Yet, amid the outpouring of encouragement, the venom of vitriol was ever present, slithering through her notifications like shadows seeking to extinguish her light. A particular message caught her eye, a direct threat from an anonymous source. "Stop this nonsense or suffer the consequences." Her breath caught in her throat, the fear mingling with anger and determination. She had anticipated resistance, But the personal nature of the threat was a stark reminder of the entrenched hatred she was up against. Elena knew that the fight was no longer just a professional crusade, it had become deeply personal. A matter of survival against forces that sought to silence her voice. Malcolm Carter entered the room, his presence a blend of exhaustion and urgency. He closed the door behind him, the sound muffled but significant. "Elena, we need to talk," he said, his voice betraying the strain he carried. "The board is escalating their efforts to undermine our initiatives. They're not just resisting change, they're actively trying to discredit us." Elena looked up, meeting his weary gaze. "I expected pushback, but this feels like an all-out assault." Malcolm nodded, taking a seat opposite her. "They've hired a PR firm to launch a counter-campaign, painting you and the activists as radicals disrupting the peace. They're also threatening legal action, claiming defamation and harassment." A cold sweat broke out across Elena's back. Legal battles were daunting, but they were not insurmountable. "We need to double down on our efforts," she stated firmly. "Expose the truth even further. Rally more support, and ensure that their tactics are transparent for everyone to see." Malcolm sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "It's not just the board. Some of our own executives are turning against us, fearing for their positions and reputations. Trust within the company is eroding, and morale is plummeting." Elena leaned forward, her eyes burning with resolve. "We have to lead by example. Show them that integrity and justice are non-negotiable. We need to implement our reforms transparently and involve third-party auditors to verify our progress." Before Malcolm could respond, Rachel Thompson burst into the room, her face flushed with urgency. "Elena, Malcolm, we've got another crisis. The leaked documents are being used to fuel the board's narrative that our reforms are mere token gestures. They're twisting the data to make it seem like we're hiding something even more sinister." Elena felt the familiar surge of frustration. "This is exactly why we need to control the narrative. We can't let them distort the facts to serve their agenda. We need to present our own comprehensive reports, backed by credible sources, to counter their misinformation." Rachel nodded, her determination evident. "I've already reached out to investigative journalists who can help us verify the authenticity of the leaked documents and highlight the company's ongoing efforts for genuine reform." As the day progressed, the trio worked tirelessly, their collaboration a beacon of hope amidst the swirling chaos. They held strategy meetings, coordinated with allies, and meticulously prepared for the inevitable confrontations that lay ahead. Each step forward was met with new challenges, but also with growing solidarity from those who believed in their cause. That evening, Elena attended a community gathering organized by a coalition of activists, lawyers, and ordinary citizens who had been touched by the airline's systemic failures. The room was filled with a palpable sense of urgency and collective strength. Stories were shared, voices were raised, and plans were made to push the movement further into the national consciousness. As she took the stage to speak, Elena felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, the expectation of those who had long awaited a leader to champion their cause. She began with a recounting of her father's struggle, his untimely death a catalyst for her own fight against injustice. Her voice resonated with raw emotion, each word a testament to the resilience and courage that fueled the movement. "We are standing at a pivotal moment," she declared, her gaze sweeping across the room. "A moment where our collective voice can no longer be ignored. We must demand accountability, transparency, and real change from those in power. This is not just about one company or one incident, it's about dismantling the very structures that perpetuate inequality and ensuring a fairer, more just society for all." The audience erupted into applause, the energy in the room a powerful affirmation of their shared mission. But as Elena stepped down from the podium, her phone buzzed with another ominous message: "You're playing with fire. And it's only a matter of time before you get burned." The threat was clear, the danger more real than ever. Determined not to let fear dictate her actions, Elena pushed the message aside. She couldn't afford to let intimidation derail the progress they had made. She had to stay focused, stay strong, for herself and for everyone who depended on her leadership. Later that night, Elena found herself at Martha Ellison's home, seeking solace and counsel. The older woman welcomed her with open arms, the warmth and wisdom in her eyes a comforting presence. "You've done well today, Elena," Martha said gently, guiding her to a chair. "But remember, the The path to true change is never easy. There will always be those who resist, who fear what they don't understand. But your strength and your voice are what will keep this movement alive. Elena nodded, her resolve reaffirmed by Martha's unwavering support. I just wish people could see beyond their fears. Understand the real impact of their actions. Martha placed a hand on her shoulder, her grip firm and reassuring. Change begins with understanding, but it requires action. You're doing both, and that's what matters most. Don't let the darkness overshadow the light you're bringing into the world. As Elena left Martha's home, the city seemed to pulse with a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges were mounting, each one testing her limits. But so was the support that surrounded her. She knew that the battle was far from over. But with each step she took, the foundation for a just and equitable future was being solidified. The night sky was clear, the stars twinkling like silent witnesses to the struggle unfolding below. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs. A reminder of the resilience that had carried her this far. The road ahead was steep, the obstacles daunting, but she was no longer alone. With allies like Martha and the unwavering support of her community, she felt ready to face whatever storms lay ahead. The crucible of change was heating up, the flames of resistance growing fiercer. But so too was the determination of those who sought to forge a better world. Elena knew that the true test of her mission lay in the days to come. But she was prepared to endure, to fight, and to lead with the unwavering belief that justice was not just a dream, but a reality waiting to be realized. The air was thick with anticipation as Elena Carter stood backstage at the Grand Auditorium, the weight of the moment pressing down on her like never before. The day had been long, filled with endless meetings, strategic planning sessions, and countless calls coordinating with journalists and activists. Now, the culmination of weeks of relentless effort was about to unfold. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline mixed with anxiety. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror, her tailored suit a symbol of her professionalism and the unyielding determination that drove her. The pendant her father had given her, a simple, elegant piece of jewelry, rested against her collarbone, a constant reminder of the legacy she was fighting to uphold. As she stepped onto the stage, the applause surged through her, a powerful affirmation of the support she had garnered. The crowd was a diverse tapestry of faces: elderly veterans, young activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens, all united by a shared desire for justice and equality. The atmosphere was electric, the air buzzing with the collective hope and frustration of those who had long felt marginalized and unheard. Elena Carter, the announcer called out, his voice echoing through the expansive hall. Please welcome our keynote speaker. Elena approached the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked out at the sea of faces, each one a testament to the strength and resilience of her community. Taking another deep breath, she began to speak, her voice steady and commanding. Thank you all for being here today. We stand at a pivotal moment in our nation's history, a moment where the call for true equity and justice can no longer be ignored. The incident on that flight was not an isolated event. It was a reflection of the systemic biases that permeate every facet of our society. Her words resonated deeply, the room hanging on every syllable. Elena recounted the journey she had undertaken, the battles fought both publicly and privately, and the unyielding spirit of those who had joined her cause. She spoke of the internal documents that exposed the airline's entrenched racism, the relentless media scrutiny, and the personal threats that had sought to silence her. But today, she continued, her voice rising with conviction, we are not just fighting against an airline's policies. We are fighting against a system that has long perpetuated inequality, that has allowed prejudice to thrive in the shadows of our institutions. It is a system that tells us we don't belong, that our voices don't matter. But today, we declare that enough is enough. As Elena spoke, the tension in the room built, her words a clarion call for action. She outlined a comprehensive plan for reform: mandatory bias training, transparent hiring practices, independent oversight committees, and the establishment of support networks for those who had been wronged. Each proposal was met with nods of approval and murmurs of agreement, the crowd absorbing every detail with eager attentiveness. But amidst the support, a sense of unease lingered. Elena could feel eyes watching her, some filled with hope, others tinged with skepticism. The struggle was far from over, and she knew that the real test was yet to come. As she concluded her speech, a roar of applause filled the auditorium, the energy of the crowd swelling with renewed determination. Elena stepped back from the podium, allowing herself a moment of relief before sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. A group of men, identifiable by their aggressive stances and hostile expressions, began to stir at the back of the auditorium. Their presence was a stark reminder that not everyone was willing to embrace the change Elena advocated. They moved forward with intent, their faces contorted with anger and disdain. "Elena Carter," one of them shouted, his voice cutting through the applause. "Your words mean nothing. You're tearing our community apart." The room fell silent, the tension palpable as the aggressors made their way toward the stage. Elena felt her pulse quicken, the adrenaline surging through her veins. She stood her ground, meeting their gaze with unwavering resolve. "Your anger is misplaced," she replied firmly. "This isn't about tearing apart, it's about building a more just and equitable society for everyone." But her words only fueled their ire. They pushed forward, their voices rising in a crescendo of hate. The situation quickly escalated, with the men shouting slurs and making derogatory remarks, their actions a brazen attempt to undermine her message. Security personnel moved in, trying to contain the situation. But the damage was already done. The confrontation had shifted the focus, momentarily derailing the momentum Elena had worked so hard to build. Panic began to ripple through the crowd, the initial unity fracturing under the strain of hostility. In the chaos, Elena saw Martha Ellison pushing through the crowd, her presence a stabilizing force. She moved quickly to intervene, placing a hand on Elena's shoulder. "Stay calm," Martha whispered, her voice a soothing balm amidst the turmoil. "Don't let them derail you." Elena took a deep breath, feeling Martha's steady grip grounding her. She looked out at the crowd, seeing both the supporters and the detractors, the faces of those who believed and those who opposed. In that moment, she realized that the fight was not just about policy changes or corporate reform, it was about changing hearts and minds, confronting deeply ingrained prejudices that had been perpetuated for generations. As the security finally managed to disperse the aggressors, the room slowly regained its composure. The crowd began to murmur, the initial shock giving way to a renewed sense of purpose. Elena stepped back to the podium, her resolve unshaken. "We cannot allow hate and ignorance to overshadow our pursuit of justice," she declared, her voice ringing out with unwavering strength. "This fight is not easy, and it will not be won overnight. But together, we can create a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or background." The applause that followed was different this time, more fervent, more heartfelt. Elena felt the collective strength of the community surge around her, the shared pain and determination forging a bond that no amount of hate could break. As the event drew to a close, Elena knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges. The confrontation had exposed the raw nerves of systemic racism, but it had also ignited a fire within her and her supporters. They had faced the ugliness of hate and come out stronger, more united in their mission. That night, as Elena sat alone in her apartment, she reflected on the day's events. The clash between love and hate, justice and prejudice, had left her both weary and invigorated. She knew that the road ahead would only grow steeper. But she also knew that she was no longer fighting alone. With allies like Martha and the unwavering support of her community, she felt a renewed sense of hope. She looked out the window, the city lights twinkling like stars in the night sky, each one a symbol of the countless lives touched by her fight. The struggle for equality was far from over. But Elena was more determined than ever to see it through. The tipping point had been reached, and she was ready to confront whatever came next, driven by the belief that a better, more just world was within reach. The crucible of change had tested her, pushed her to her limits, but it had also forged her into a stronger, more resilient leader. As she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, she felt the weight of her mission settle around her, a mantle she was ready to bear. The battle was intensifying, but so was her resolve to fight for a future where justice and equality were not just ideals, but lived realities for all. The first light of dawn seeped through the curtains of Elena Carter's apartment, casting a soft glow on the scattered papers and the remnants of last night's strategy sessions. The air was thick with the remnants of anxiety and the promise of a new day. Elena sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, contemplating the events that had led her to this pivotal moment. The final confrontation at the awards ceremony had not only shaken the foundation of the airline but had also ignited a fire within her that could no longer be contained. Her phone buzzed incessantly, a relentless reminder of the storm that raged outside her personal sanctuary. Messages poured in from supporters and detractors alike, each one a testament to the deep-seated divisions that still plagued the nation. But amidst the chaos, one message stood out. A plea for help from a young woman who had experienced similar discrimination at another airline. Elena felt a surge of responsibility, knowing that her fight was not just her own but belonged to countless others who had been silenced and marginalized. Malcolm Carter entered the room, his face etched with fatigue but his eyes still burning with determination. "We need to address the leaked documents head-on," he said, his voice a blend of urgency and frustration. "The public is losing faith in our efforts. We have to prove that our reforms are genuine and not just for show." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. "I agree. We need transparency. Let's organize a press conference where we lay everything out, the documents, our proposed reforms, and our commitment to real change. We can't let them twist the narrative any longer." As they prepared for the day ahead, Elena's mind wandered to the faces of those she had met along this journey, each one a reflection of the struggle and resilience that defined their fight against systemic racism. She thought of Martha Ellison, whose unwavering support had been a beacon of hope, and of the young woman who had reached out for help, her story echoing the injustices Elena had witnessed firsthand. The press conference was scheduled for noon, and the auditorium was filled with journalists, activists, and concerned citizens. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, the air thick with the unspoken tension of a nation grappling with its conscience. Elena stood at the podium, her heart pounding in her chest, but her voice steady and resolute. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her gaze sweeping across the room. "We are here to confront the uncomfortable truths that have long been hidden in the shadows of our society. The leaked documents reveal a pattern of systemic racism and corruption within our airline that cannot be ignored or dismissed." She paused, letting her words sink in. This is not an isolated incident. It is a reflection of a broader, deeply ingrained issue that affects countless individuals every day. Our commitment to reform is not just about addressing these specific failures but about dismantling the structures that allow such injustices to persist. As Elena continued, presenting the evidence and outlining the comprehensive reforms they had implemented, the room remained silent, the gravity of her message resonating with every listener. She spoke of mandatory bias training, transparent hiring practices, independent oversight committees, and the establishment of support networks for those who had been wronged. Each proposal was met with nods of approval and murmurs of agreement, the crowd absorbing every detail with a growing sense of hope and determination. But just as she was reaching the climax of her speech, a sudden commotion erupted at the back of the auditorium. A group of men, identifiable by their aggressive stances and hostile expressions, began to shout interruptions, their voices filled with anger and disdain. "Elena Carter, you're tearing this country apart with your lies," one of them bellowed, his face contorted with rage. "You think you're some kind of hero. But you're just fueling the fire of division." The room fell silent, the tension palpable as the aggressors made their way toward the stage. Elena felt her pulse quicken, the adrenaline surging through her veins. She stood her ground, her eyes meeting theirs with unwavering resolve. "Your anger is misplaced," she responded firmly. "This isn't about tearing apart, it's about building a more just and equitable society for everyone." But her words only fueled their ire. They moved forward with intent, their voices rising in a crescendo of hate. The situation quickly escalated, with the men shouting slurs and making derogatory remarks, their actions a brazen attempt to undermine her message. Security personnel moved in, trying to contain the situation. But the damage was already done. The confrontation had shifted the focus, momentarily derailing the momentum Elena had worked so hard to build. Panic began to ripple through the crowd, the initial unity fracturing under the strain of hostility. In the midst of the chaos, Elena saw Martha Ellison pushing through the crowd, her presence a stabilizing force. She moved quickly to intervene, placing a hand on Elena's shoulder. "Stay calm," Martha whispered, her voice a soothing balm amidst the turmoil. "Don't let them derail you." Elena took a deep breath, feeling Martha's steady grip grounding her. She looked out at the crowd, seeing both the supporters and the detractors, the faces of those who believed and those who opposed. In that moment, she realized that the fight was not just about policy changes or corporate reform, it was about changing hearts and minds. Confronting deeply ingrained prejudices that had been perpetuated for generations. As the security finally managed to disperse the aggressors, the room slowly regained its composure. The crowd began to murmur, the initial shock giving way to a renewed sense of purpose. Elena stepped back to the podium, her resolve unshaken. We cannot allow hate and ignorance to overshadow our pursuit of justice, she declared, her voice ringing out with unwavering strength. This fight is not easy, and it will not be won overnight. But together, we can create a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or background. The applause that followed was different this time, more fervent, more heartfelt. Elena felt the collective strength of the community surge around her, the shared pain and determination forging a bond that no amount of hate could break. As the event drew to a close, Elena knew that the journey ahead would be fraught with challenges. The confrontation had exposed the raw nerves of systemic racism, but it had also ignited a fire within her and her supporters. They had faced the ugliness of hate and come out stronger, more united in their mission. That night, as Elena sat alone in her apartment, she reflected on the day's events. The clash between love and hate, justice and prejudice, had left her both weary and invigorated. She knew that the road ahead would be steep, the obstacles daunting, but she also knew that she was no longer alone. With allies like Martha and the unwavering support of her community, she felt a renewed sense of hope. She looked out the window, the city lights twinkling like stars in the night sky, each one a symbol of the countless lives touched by her fight. The struggle for equality was far from over, but Elena was more determined than ever to see it through. The tipping point had been reached, and she was ready to confront whatever came next, driven by the unyielding belief that justice was not just a dream, but a reality waiting to be realized. As the dawn broke, casting a golden hue over the city, Elena felt the first rays of hope warming her resolve. The dawn of reckoning had arrived, and with it, the promise of a new day, one where the shadows of prejudice and discrimination could finally begin to recede, giving way to a brighter, more just future for all. The journey was perilous, but Elena knew that with each step she took, the foundation for a better world was being laid. The crucible of change had tested her, pushed her to her limits, but it had also forged her into a stronger, more resilient leader. As she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, she felt the weight of her mission settle around her, a mantle she was ready to bear. The battle was intensifying, but so was her resolve to fight for a future where justice and equality were not just ideals, but lived realities for all. And as the first light of day broke through the darkness, Elena Carter stood ready to lead the charge, her spirit unbroken, her heart full of unwavering determination. The dawn of reckoning was here, and she was prepared to embrace it, knowing that the fight for justice was the fight of her life and it was a fight she was destined to win.